They saw a simple medic, good for bandages and a calm voice. But when a base-shattering blast left a decorated colonel dying, her hands were about to perform a miracle that would break every rule in the book. Sergeant Kate O'Malley was a ghost, and that's exactly how she wanted it. At 30, her sharp, intelligent blue eyes missed nothing. A stark contrast to the fiery red hair she kept wrangled in a messy but practical bun. Here at Combat Outpost, Cop Griffin, a dusty speck of defiance in Afghanistan's notorious Kandahar province. She was just Doc O'Malley. She was the one you went to for infected blisters, a nagging cough, or a stitched-up gash from cleaning your rifle. Her file said she was a competent 91W combat medic, standard Army training, reliable under pressure. It was a masterpiece of a mission. No one at COP Griffin knew that 3 years prior, Dr. Catherine O'Malley had been a rising star in the Cleveland Clinic's trauma surgery department. A Stanford residency had forged her skills, and she was on a trajectory that promised prestige, a $500,000 salary, and a life insulated from the grit and chaos she now called home. That life had shattered during a brutal Ohio blizzard. After a 40-hour shift fueled by caffeine and sheer willpower, a multi-vehicle pileup had flooded the ER. One patient, a young father, had presented with what looked like manageable injuries. But a hidden complication, a slow internal bleed masked by other trauma, had claimed his life on her table. The review board called it an unavoidable tragedy, given the circumstances, a casualty of a system stretched to its breaking point. But Kate called it her failure. Haunted by the man's face, she had abdicated her throne of scrubs and sterile fields. She walked away from the life she'd built and enlisted, seeking anonymity and perhaps penance in the most austere environment she could find. For 10 months, Cop Griffin had been her monastery. The simplicity of basic care was a balm. Cleaning wounds, dispensing Motrin, and listening to soldiers talk about home, it was medicine stripped of the godlike responsibility she had once carried. She was useful, but no one's life rested solely in her hands. She had found a fragile peace in the dust and the heat, a quiet rhythm punctuated by the distant crackle of patrols and the whir of generators. That peace, and the world as she knew it, was obliterated at 7:19 hours on a blistering Wednesday morning. Kate was in the small medical tent, methodically organizing a new shipment of 4 bags, when the first explosion hit. It wasn't a sound. It was a physical blow, a wave of pressure that slammed her against a metal supply cabinet. Before she could recover, a second, more powerful blast ripped the tent's canvas from its moorings, showering her with sand and debris. Through the ringing in her ears, a third detonation followed, a deep, gut-wrenching roar that confirmed her worst fear. This wasn't random mortar fire. This was a coordinated, complex attack designed for maximum carnage. The fragile peace was over. The ghost was about to be dragged back into the light. Grabbing her aid bag, Kate scrambled out of the ruined tent into a scene from hell. The air, thick with the acrid stench of cordite, ozone, and the coppery tang of blood, was a physical entity she had to push through. A massive vehicle-borne IED had detonated near the command center, collapsing the structure into a twisted pyre of concrete and rebar. A secondary explosion from the ammunition supply point had followed, turning the heart of the outpost into a kill zone. The ground was hot, littered with smoking shrapnel and the unrecognizable debris of daily life. Screams tore through the air, a horrifying chorus of agony, shock, and calls for lost comrades. Her training took over a cold, clinical autopilot that suppressed the rising panic. She ran toward the epicenter of the destruction, her eyes scanning, triaging, categorizing the chaos into treatable and untreatable wounds. Master Sergeant Gunny Miller, the company's senior NCO and a man whose weathered face was a roadmap of 2 decades at war, was trying to organize a rescue effort near the collapsed command post. A river of blood flowed from a gash on his forehead, but he seemed oblivious to it. "O'Malley, thank God," he yelled, his voice hoarse. "It's a slaughterhouse. We got men trapped. Start triage. Now, tell us who to dig for first." He didn't need to say the rest. In a mass casualty incident, The cold calculus of combat medicine was law. You save the savable. Those with a fighting chance get immediate care. The critically wounded, those deemed expectant, were to be made comfortable, their resources allocated to others with better odds. It was a brutal, necessary logic she had once taught to interns. Her surgeon's eye, a faculty she had tried to dull for 3 years, reawakened with terrifying clarity. It saw past the superficial gore to the true, underlying injuries. The soldier with a mangled leg, screaming in pain, he'd live. Tourniquet, pressure dressing, morphine. The one lying silently with a seemingly minor head wound. His fixed, dilated pupils told a different story. Massive intracranial pressure. Nothing could be done for him here. She moved with an economy of motion that felt alien in her medic's uniform, a phantom limb of her old life. As she worked, a dreadful realization dawned. There were too many. At least 60 casualties, many of them critical, and several needed immediate, invasive surgery. Procedures far beyond the scope of a field medic and impossible to perform before they bled out. "Doc, over here." Gunny's voice cut through the din again. "We found the colonel. He's alive, but it's bad." Kate sprinted toward the call, her boots crunching on shattered concrete. She found Colonel Jackson Jack Thorne, the base commander, half buried beneath a collapsed concrete beam. He was conscious, his face a pale mask of shock, but his eyes were sharp. A compound fracture had turned his right leg into a grotesque angle, and a dark, rapidly expanding pool of blood was soaking the sand beneath his abdomen. Arterial bleeding. He had minutes. "Colonel, can you hear me?" she asked, her fingers already at his neck, checking his carotid pulse. It was thready and fast. "O'Malley," he rasped, his voice surprisingly firm. "Report. How bad is it?" She glanced at the wound in his abdomen, a vicious tear from a piece of shrapnel. Her mind instantly diagnosed it. Probable splenic rupture, possible liver laceration, and a severed femoral artery in his leg. In a hospital, he'd be rushed to an or for a multi-hour surgery by a full team. Here, in the dirt and chaos, it was an unequivocal death sentence. "Sir, we're going to get you out of here," she said, the lie tasting like ash in her mouth. He grabbed her arm, his grip shockingly strong. How many casualties? She took in the panorama of devastation. "Too many, sir. Far too many." His gaze held hers, unwavering. "Then you know the protocol. Sergeant, you do what you have to do. Save my men." Kate stared back at him, the weight of his command settling on her. He was ordering her to let him die. In triage, a colonel with his injuries was black-tagged. Expectant, a waste of precious resources. But looking at the life draining out of him, she knew something else. She had the skills. She could save him. And in that moment, she understood that her penance wasn't about hiding. It was about acting when no one else could. The ghost was done running. "Gunny." Kate's voice cut through the chaos with an authority that made the master sergeant turn instantly. "I need a backboard and a field surgical kit. Now, a surgical kit." Gunny stared at her, his face a mask of confusion. "Doc, what for?" "We need to stabilize him and—" "There's no time for stabilization," she interrupted, her hands already working, cutting away the blood-soaked fabric of the colonel's uniform. The wound was exactly as she'd feared. He's bleeding out internally. He won't survive the wait for a medevac. Just then, a young, fresh-faced officer, Lieutenant Evans, rushed over. He was known for being strictly by the book, his grasp of regulations far exceeding his experience with real-world carnage. "Sergeant, what are you doing?" Evans demanded, his eyes wide with a mixture of horror and indignation. "Colonel Thorne is expectant. Triage protocol dictates we focus on the green and yellow tags. You're wasting time and resources." Kate didn't look up. Her focus was absolute. "With all due respect, Lieutenant, you're wrong. Give me that kit, Gunny." Something in her tone, a cold, hard certainty, made Miller move. He ran off, shouting orders. "Sergeant, I am giving you a direct order." Evans stepped closer, his voice rising. "Stand down. Your actions are in violation of Article 92 of the UCMJ, failure to obey a lawful order." I will have you brought up on charges." Kate finally looked at him, her blue eyes like chips of ice. "Then you do that, Lieutenant. But right now, I'm saving your commanding officer's life. You can either help me, or you can get the hell out of my way." She turned back to the colonel as Gunny returned with a surgical kit and a backboard. She snapped on a pair of sterile gloves, her movements a blur of practiced efficiency. This wasn't a medic patching a wound. This was a surgeon commanding an operating theater. She barked orders at 2 stunned soldiers who had gathered nearby. "I need you to apply direct pressure here, on his thigh. Use your body weight. Don't let up, no matter what. You," she pointed to the other, "hold this 4 bag as high as you can." Her fingers, nimble and sure, probed the abdominal wound. She used a hemostat not as a clamp, but to gently move aside tissue, her touch impossibly delicate. She found the source of the bleeding, a ruptured spleen, and began the kind of emergency procedure taught only in advanced surgical fellowships. She didn't have the proper tools, so she improvised, using 2 pairs of forceps as a makeshift clamp and sterile gauze for packing. Her hands moved with a muscle memory forged over thousands of hours, a dance of precision and instinct that left the onlookers speechless. This wasn't field medicine. This was a miracle happening in the dirt. The bleeding slowed. The colonel's shallow breathing began to deepen. His blood pressure, which she monitored with a cuff and her own fingers on his wrist, began to stabilize. Evans watched, his jaw slack with disbelief. The medic he had tried to discipline was performing a procedure he couldn't even name, violating a dozen regulations to save a man he had already written off. Kate finished her work, applying a temporary dressing. "All right, let's get him on the backboard." Gently, as they secured him, she looked up, her gaze fixed on the distant ridge that marked the designated medevac landing zone. It was 2 miles away, across unsecured, potentially mine terrain. "Lieutenant," she said, her voice strained with effort, but steady. "I need you to organize a carry team. For men, rotating. We're moving him to the LZ." Evans finally found his voice, shaking his head in stunned protest. "That's suicide, Sergeant. We haven't cleared that route. And we have 50 other wounded men here. The other wounded need a real hospital, which is on its way." Kate shot back, her breath coming in ragged pants. "But I can keep the colonel alive if we move now." She had just performed surgery in a war zone. But saving everyone else required a fully staffed surgical team, something she was not. She had made her choice. She had saved this one life. Now she had to get him home. As the soldiers prepared to lift the stretcher, Evans, still reeling, looked from the stabilized colonel to the small, red-headed medic who had defied him. He stepped back, his face pale, and uttered the only thing that came to his mind. "You save him for a moment, but now you're both going to die out there." The journey was a descent into a special kind of hell. The weight of Colonel Thorne on the makeshift stretcher was immense, a dead weight that strained the shoulders and backs of the 4 soldiers carrying him. Kate walked beside them, her eyes constantly scanning the surrounding hills for threats, her hands never far from the 4 bag, monitoring the drip rate. The sun was relentless, baking the arid landscape and turning the air into a shimmering furnace. Every step was an effort, a battle against the terrain, the heat, and the crushing exhaustion. They had been moving for 20 minutes when the sharp crack of a sniper rifle echoed from the hills. The bullet whizzed past, striking a rock just a few feet from them with a violent spray of stone fragments. "Down!" Kate screamed, shoving the stretcher team toward the cover of a low, crumbling wall. A piece of flying shrapnel had sliced across her cheek, and she felt the warm trickle of her own blood, but she ignored it. Huddled behind the wall, hearts pounding, she immediately checked the colonel. His vitals were holding, but for how long? The sniper was out there, patient, waiting. They were pinned down. "O'Malley," Thorne whispered, his eyes open and lucid. "Leave me. Take the men and fall back." "That's an order." "Can't do that, sir," she replied, her voice low as she peered over the wall, trying to pinpoint the sniper's location. "We're almost a third of the way there." "You performed surgery back there," he stated, his voice raspy but clear. "In the rubble. That wasn't in any medic's manual I've ever read." "Who taught you that?" His gaze was intense, searching. "The way you move like a surgeon." Kate paused, the question hanging in the tense air between them, punctuated by the silence of the unseen hunter. She chose her words carefully. "I used to work in a very bright, clean place, sir," she said, her eyes still scanning the ridge. "A place where making a mistake costs you everything. The consequences are the same here, just a lot dustier." The answer seemed to satisfy him. He didn't press further. A tense silence fell over them, broken only by the wind. After 10 agonizing minutes, the crackle of their own company's counter-sniper team came over the radio, reporting the threat neutralized. They could move again, but the delay had cost them. As they pushed on, the terrain grew worse, a steep, rocky incline that turned every step into a struggle. One of the carriers stumbled, nearly dropping the stretcher. Kate lunged forward, her smaller frame straining to take the weight, her muscles screaming in protest. For a terrifying moment, she thought they would all go down, but she found a reserve of strength she didn't know she possessed, dug her heels in, and stabilized the stretcher. She was running on pure adrenaline now. Her years as a surgical resident, those grueling 40-hour shifts, had forged an endurance in her that was more mental than physical. She had been exhausted before, pushed past every conceivable limit, forced to perform miracles when her body was screaming for rest. This was just another day in the ER, except the ER was a mountain pass, and the patient was on a stretcher instead of a gurney. As they cleared the incline and the LZ came into view, a small, flat plateau less than half a mile away, Thorne's condition took a sudden, terrifying turn. His breathing became shallow, and his pulse, which Kate checked obsessively, grew weak and erratic. "He's crashing," she yelled. "He's going into shock." There was no time to stop. She grabbed the 4 bag, squeezing it with one hand to force the fluids in faster, while keying her radio with the other. "Mayday, mayday. This is Griffin 6 Actuals Escort. Requesting immediate medevac at designated LZ. Patient is a GSW, post-exploratory laparotomy for splenic lac. Now, going into hypovolemic shock. Vitals are..." She rattled off the numbers, her voice a strained but professional beacon in the chaos. They ran, stumbling and gasping, their lungs on fire. The last 400 yards were a blur of pain and desperation. As they collapsed onto the plateau, the rhythmic thump-thump-thump of an incoming Black Hawk helicopter filled the air. It was their salvation, but as Kate looked down at the colonel's pale, still face, she prayed it wasn't too late. The Black Hawk descended in a maelstrom of dust and wind. The flight medic, a seasoned sergeant first class, jumped out before the skids even touched the ground, his face a grim mask of professional focus. As they loaded Colonel Thorne onto the helicopter, Kate began her handover report, the words spilling out in a rush of clinical precision. Temporary splenic packing and ephemeral artery ligation with improvised tools. Push 2 units of saline, but he's still hypotensive and tachycardic. He needs blood and a reel, or now. The flight medic stopped what he was doing and stared at her, his eyes wide with disbelief. He looked from Kate's blood-streaked face to the makeshift but effective handiwork on his patient. A temporary splenic packing? Sergeant, that's not just medicine, that's artistry under fire. Where the hell did you learn that? Kate just shook her head, too exhausted to form a reply. Just keep him alive. As the helicopter lifted off, carrying the man whose life she had tied herself to, she finally allowed the crushing weight of the last few hours to settle on her. She had done it. She had walked through fire and defied death. The walk back to COP Griffin was a long, solitary journey, each step heavier than the last. 2 weeks later, Colonel Thorne returned. He walked with a cane, but he was alive, his recovery astonishingly swift. He summoned her to his makeshift office. "O'Malley," he began, his voice devoid of its usual command authority, replaced by something quieter, more personal. "I've had a lot of time to think about what you did." "I did my job, sir," she said, her standard, deflective reply. "No," he said, shaking his head slowly. "You did someone else's job. I had my staff do some digging, Kate. Your file says you're a 91W with a high school diploma and a few college credits. But the man who saved my life was a Stanford-trained surgeon. My life was saved by Dr. O'Malley, not Sergeant O'Malley. The directness of it caught her off guard. She met his gaze, her own steady. There was no point in denying it further. Sir, in that rubble, we all just were what we needed to be. My file doesn't lie, it just doesn't tell the whole story. No, it doesn't, he agreed. He leaned forward, his expression serious. I'm recommending you for the Distinguished Service Cross. What you did was... Sir, with all due respect, I don't want it, she interrupted softly. I don't need a medal. I just needed to do my job right this time. The last 3 words were barely a whisper, a confession she hadn't realized she was holding. Thorne studied her for a long moment, a deep, profound understanding passing between them. He saw the ghost in her eyes, the lingering shadow of a past failure. He didn't push for details. He didn't need to. He slid a folder across the desk. Some stories don't need to be told, he said gently. They just need to be passed on. She opened the folder. It was a recommendation for a transfer. Not to another dusty outpost, but to the Army Medical Center of Excellence in San Antonio. The position was for a special instructor for the Advanced Combat Trauma course. Your file may not tell the whole story, the colonel said, a faint smile on his lips. But your hands do. It's time they taught others. Kate accepted the assignment. In the sterile, air-conditioned classrooms of San Antonio, she found a new kind of peace. She was still Sergeant O'Malley, but here, her past was not a secret to be hidden, but a resource to be shared. She taught the next generation of combat medics, not just what was in the manual, but what to do when the manual was useless, when the rules had to be broken to save a life. Unofficially, her module became known as the Thorne Initiative. It was a grueling, hands-on course that pushed medics to their absolute limits, teaching them how to improvise, how to perform procedures far beyond their pay grade when there were no other options. She used her knowledge from both worlds, the pristine operating rooms of the Cleveland Clinic and the blood-soaked sands of Kandahar, to forge a new kind of medic, one with the courage of a soldier and the hands of a surgeon. The official report on the COP Griffin attack circulated quietly through the upper echelons of the Army Medical Command. It sparked a fierce debate about field-expedient surgery, medical authority, and the untapped potential of soldiers with unconventional backgrounds. Sergeant Kate O'Malley's name became a legend, a symbol of the idea that true capability isn't defined by a rank or a file, but by the will to act in the face of impossible odds. The rules, she taught her students, were there to serve life, not to constrain it. She had walked into the desert to bury a part of herself, to pay a debt she felt she owed. But instead of an ending, she found a new beginning. She hadn't erased the ghost of the patient she'd lost. She had honored his memory by saving countless others, by ensuring that his loss would give birth to a legacy of life. The woman who had been just a field medic had become a bridge, a teacher, a quiet legend. She had learned that salvation isn't found in running from your past, but in using it to build a better future. Kate O'Malley's story is a powerful reminder that heroes often hide in plain sight, defined not by their titles, but by their choices in the darkest of hours. What part of her journey resonated with you the most? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Please be kind and comment with respect for the service members depicted. And if this story moved you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more tales of incredible courage.